Welcome to Leadership Reimagined, where game-changing conversations are reshaping the world of work. I'm Janice Ellig, the CEO and founder of Ellig Group, Executive Search Advisors, where we are reimagining search through our long-standing commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. On today's topic, 2023 Priorities and Predictions for the C-Suite, I am honored to welcome visionary Kevin Oakes, CEO and founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity, I4CP, a prominent global human capital research company and ranked among the fastest growing companies on the Inc. 500 5000. I4CP, whose clients include Amazon, Nike, and Microsoft, is the leading authority on next practices in human capital and produces more research than any other human capital research firm in the world. Kevin was on the Association for Talent Development, now ATD, board for 5 years, and he served as chairman in 2006. He's on multiple boards, including the board of Proformative, Best Buddies, Washington, D.C., and also the advisory board of EdCast, Guild Education, and Sanctuary. A frequent international keynote speaker on the strategic use of human capital, Kevin is the author of Culture Renovation, 18 Leadership Actions to Build an Unshakable Company, and is the co-author of the Executive Guide to Integrated Talent Management. We have much to cover, including many good points in his book, and as we summarize at the end, Kevin will give us some of his key takeaways and what you don't want to miss and what we all need to do in leading companies. Kevin, I'm truly delighted you could join us today.
Oh, thanks, Janet. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me on the show.
Well, when I read you produce more research than any other human capital research firm in the world, that's saying a lot. So how did you get into this business? What sparked your interest in researching the role of culture for organizational success and the importance of people?
Yeah, we have a team of analysts here at I4CP, Janice, and have been doing this for a number of years. Culture has always been a thread throughout a lot of the research that we do. And we really research almost every topic you can think of underneath the human capital or HR umbrella. I've always been fascinated by the impact that a healthy culture can have on an organization. And as a result, we've conducted some pretty seminal studies on that subject. The one that really fueled the book was one of the largest culture studies that I'm aware of. We had over 7,000 organizations participate in that study. And the basis of it was understanding that most companies who try to change their culture fail, and most fail miserably. But there's a small percentage that succeed. Our research shows that about 15% actually succeed in changing their culture. Companies like Microsoft, for instance, who have done a marvelous job under Satya Nadella in changing the culture. And so we wanted to really understand, was there a commonality amongst those 15% that others could learn from? And our research study created a blueprint of 18 action steps that organizations could take, almost sequential action steps, in order to effectively change culture. And that's what preceded the book. And then I wrote a book based on that study and got the cooperation of many Fortune 500 CEOs and CHROs and other folks in the industry. And so I'm just thrilled that the book's been so well received.
Culture renovation is more about not just starting from scratch, ground up, and trying to transform, but really spearheading certain different practices, right? And so how does that apply like during the pandemic? What was your advice to CEOs and leaders when there's no playbook, right? And They had to be agile and they had to pivot, sort of the what if scenarios that P&C companies go through all the time. What was your advice to companies during that pandemic?
I think the pandemic showed every organization how important agility is. If you have a company that fears change or wishes things wouldn't change, then you're probably going to be a low performance organization. Our research has always shown that companies where the workforce looks at change as normal, but even more aggressively, they look at change as an opportunity in the marketplace. Those are the companies that typically perform very well. And the pandemic showed every company that you have to be an agile organization in order to survive. And the more agile you are, the more you're going to thrive. And so we've done a lot of work during and post pandemic around the topic of culture. Surprisingly, a number of cultures improved during the pandemic. Our research says that 43% of organizations reported that their culture actually got healthier because there was a lot more empathy shown by senior leaders to the workforce. There was a lot more intentional collaboration and communication amongst the workforce. And frankly, flexibility in the workforce for many organizations has really helped the well-being of that workforce and the productivity. But conversely, about a third of companies reported that their culture got worse during the pandemic for a lot of the same reasons, right? They weren't good at collaborating and weren't intentional about it. Senior leaders didn't show the empathy. They just weren't used to working with a remote workforce, or didn't handle disruptions to their business very well. So I think we'll look back on the pandemic timeframe as a really interesting time in history where we can see how agile companies were and which companies weren't agile.
So, do we see another book in your future of how the agile ones performed, what they did, and what the others who didn't do so well, that one third, what they didn't do?
We'll see. I joke all the time. When you write a book, all everybody wants to know is when you're going to write your next book. So we'll see what's in the future.
So, what are some of the lessons from your book? Let's jump into that a little bit in terms of what were the lessons learned from your research in terms of high performing companies versus lower performing. And I heard you on another interview where somebody said list is really one thing, people. Is that what you found?
Yeah, for sure. We're in an era where most of the assets of organizations are intangible, right? It's the people in the organization and in the IP that you have. The book is really based on this notion that culture transformation it's really just not common. But that was the term we were using for our research in the beginning. But as we got into it and I started looking at all these companies that had successfully changed their culture, none of them transformed their culture. They didn't become something completely different than they were before. Instead, like an old house, and that was really the analogy used, they carefully renovated their culture and they kept what made them unique and what made them great to begin with and what was hard to replace. But they improved for the future to improve the value of the organization, just like you would an old house. And so renovation became a much more approachable term to use when thinking about changing culture. And as we got into it, there were a number of things that organizations that were successful did. And, as I said earlier, we came up with 18 steps. In using that renovation theme, we divided those into 3 phases, just like you would an old house. So it's plan is the first phase. The second phase is build. And the third phase is maintain. And understanding those phases is important because I think the natural reaction for a lot of new CEOs or just executives who are trying to change culture is to dive right in and start building the new culture. But like an old house, you wouldn't just run into the old house and start knocking down walls without a plan, without a blueprint, because eventually you're going to take down a load-bearing wall. And the same analogy holds true in organizations. If you do it without careful planning, you're likely to destroy something that made that organization very unique. And so we carefully laid out steps under that plan phase, starting with listening to the workforce. And all of the companies that did a great job at changing their culture, they first really embarked on a comprehensive listening strategy to understand what are the issues and what's working well, what's not working well, underlying in the workforce. I tell this to senior executive teams all the time. The worst thing you can do is go lock yourself in a conference room and decide amongst yourselves what the culture is and what needs to be fixed, because you'll get it wrong. Things get filtered by the time it gets up to the senior executive team. And so you really need to take the time to listen and understand before you embark on anything else.
I remember that from my corporate days. So, and that's really a lot of the frontline workers, correct? When you say do a listening, really all levels within the organization.
All levels, right.
And so as you go forward in your own company, you're an entrepreneur, you're building your companies also from scratch, some of them. What, and you're one of the fastest growing companies. How are you driving your own innovation and culture change within your company to continue to be a leader in your industry?
Well, we talk about it quite a bit inside our organization. Now, we're probably a little bit unique in that I've got a lot of human capital experts, in the company, and they understand these issues. So it's a little easier to probably talk about these issues. But I think when you're building a company as an entrepreneur, and I've given this advice to many entrepreneur friends, as to be as transparent as possible is both the easiest way to build a company and a very effective way to build it. And I've been a fan of open book management for many, many years. And any company I've run, I've taken that approach where I want all the employees to understand all aspects of how we're doing as an organization. And so in my company today, for example, once a month, we go over all the financials of the company. How did we do versus plan? How did we do versus last year? What was our top line sales? What's our recognized revenue? What's EBITDA? And I've had to, teach a number of people what that means. But we look at that on a regular basis. And the reason I do that is because all the employees in our company are owners of the company. They all have equity in the company. I want to treat them like owners because I want them to act like owners because they are. And so when we look at these financials, I want them to understand what's happening within the organization. So it's not just my problem or my CFO's problem if there's a hiccup in our execution of strategy. I want everybody to feel that, and I want them to come up with creative ideas to address that problem. That to me is the fastest way to grow a company, and just really using the collective wisdom of the employees. We is always smarter than me, and I think the more you can capture that in a growing company, the better off you'll be.
And so for public companies, maybe where employees have stock, you're saying to treat them as owners, to open up, be more transparent about
Absolutely,
financials
yeah.
and such. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in a public company, all these financials are obviously open to anybody to take a look at. But transparency goes deeper than that, and I think the more you can minimize rumors inside the organization, which is what really is the death knell for a lot of companies, and having secrets inside the organization, the more transparent you can be and clear you can be in what our strategy is and where we're going as an organization, the healthier the culture is going to be.
So where does DEI fall in culture renovation? What's its importance? What's its impact? What should leaders be focused on in terms of that diversive, inclusive, and equitable organization?
All of our research and a lot of other people's research as well shows that the more diversity you can have at all levels inside the organization, the better performing you are as a company. The healthier the culture will be if you have more diversity throughout the organization. So, as you know, diversity is only one level. Inclusion and belonging. Having an equitable policies, equitable pay. All of those play into the whole umbrella of DE&I. And that's one of our biggest areas of research. We spend quite a bit of time in this arena. We have a board of chief diversity officers that we run. We have another group that's for people below that level called our DE&I Exchange. That's a very active group. And we explore with these groups all the different things that are working, not working. And in the book, Culture Renovation, I devoted a whole chapter to leveraging employee affinity groups, or ERGs, to help with culture change. It's clearly critically important, but I also cautioned at our annual conference just a couple of weeks ago in Arizona, I cautioned the room of HR executives that no matter what side of the political aisle you're on right now, we're in a bit of a war on woke. And DE&I falls squarely, for a lot of people, into the woke category. And I've told HR execs, I think you're going to need to be prepared, if you aren't doing it already, to defend your DE&I programs and your investment in DE&I. I was pretty dismayed to see that there were a number of pundits and even politicians who were blaming the Silicon Valley Bank collapse on too much attention to diversity. And I saw one sarcastic comment from a commentator that the company didn't have a chief compliance officer, but it did have a chief diversity officer, and that was supposed to be a slight, I guess, on the company. And it's just kind of ridiculous. And I think most of us would think it's ridiculous, but it's the reality. In today's environment, that there's going to be a pretty large audience that looks very cynically at this whole arena. And so I just want HR execs to be prepared for that going forward.
That's important to note, because even during the financial crisis, Lehman Brothers, when you looked at the capabilities of its board, there was, I think, one person, maybe, and the CEO, who knew what derivatives meant. So I think when you look at Silicon Valley Bank, you really have to look at the competencies and those skills on that board versus the gender diversity or ethnic diversity, right? It's really about the skill diversity.
Yeah, I would agree. Yep.
Right. So I heard the same thing, but then when you looked further, you said, wait a second, that board really was not, did not have all the skills it needed for the risk that was involved here. So,
Right.
But it's always quick to blame, right? And always cuts in programs. So what is your advice then going forward for CHROs in terms of overhiring more diverse candidates, training them, because part of the issue is we have that leaky valve, right? Mid-career, they leave. There's no mentorship. They don't get feedback. That's part of some of the other research that's been given, right? And so when people don't get that feedback, they don't feel mentored, they leave. So what's the advice in terms of keeping that pipeline full with gender and other underrepresented groups to enhance diversity? And so you don't end up at the top with all, Caucasian men.
Well, I think it's important to pay attention to the data, right? So you should be looking at data across the board inside the organization. It is very common, as you just alluded to, that companies who are trying to create a more diverse workforce, it gets less and less diverse the higher up you get inside the organization. So you should probably have some goals as you're looking at the inclusive nature of the workforce. And track those goals on a regular basis. I've always thought that Intel did a great job at this, and hold people accountable for those goals. And by people, it's usually hiring managers. Make sure they understand how their jobs play into this whole process and how they're doing versus those goals. The more you pay attention to the data, then the less subjective this becomes. And today, I think there's a number of companies that are doing a very good job at paying attention to it.
So for CHROs to really be there spearheading this with the data that will support continuing the emphasis on a more diverse workforce for better decision making. Before we go on, I want to make a quick reminder to our audience. You are listening to 2023 Priorities and Predictions for the C-Suite with Kevin Oakes, CEO and founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity, I4CP. The topics we cover, like today's, are all current, and a new topic with a new game changer is released every month. This is a great way to stay current on relevant issues happening around us. Now let's return to Kevin Oakes. I want to talk now a little bit about how you lead and manage a multicultural workforce and a multi-generational workforce. We hear so much about the millennials, the baby boomers. I think the silent generation is finally all retired. But how does someone lead today, manage today, and really help to renovate that culture with so many dynamics?
I have sort of a knee-jerk reaction when we lump an entire generation together and try to treat them the same. To me, that's no different than lumping a race together or gender together and doing the same thing. So I don't advise people to look at this and say, how am I going to treat Gen Z? I usually talk to people about you're treating these individuals as individuals, right? And not changing just based on the year they were born. But I do think in today's environment, being a people manager is getting more and more challenging. Not so much because of different generations. It's really because of different work structures. Today, we have people who are on site. A lot of managers have people who are remote. They're managing hybrid teams. They may not have a lot of experience in managing remote employees. They typically don't have a lot of experience managing even hybrid meetings, where you've got some people in the meeting and some people dialing in, over Zoom or what have you. And so for a lot of managers, that's a new skill set that they have to adopt and get good at. It's also a different era too. We talk about in our priorities and predictions report that managers have to work through perceived paradoxes, and that will define them as a top leader. And what we mean by that is at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot more focus based on empathy and the well-being of the workforce, not just the physical well-being, but the mental and emotional well-being. And there's a lot of other aspects, financial and social well-being, et cetera. It wasn't that long ago where it was sort of taboo to talk about some of these issues with your employees. And today it's encouraged, but a lot of managers don't know how to do it just yet. So that's one element of managing, and the pendulum has swung a little bit from the empathetic approach at the beginning of the pandemic to now there's a lot more focus on strategy execution and KPIs and OKRs and how are managers helping employees achieve their goals. So it's definitely a challenging time, Janice, and I think companies have to be prepared to help managers through it.
Right. And so who owns that? Because if it's just the CHRO, that won't work. If it's just the CEO, that won't work. Is it a team at the top? How do you really, renovate that culture with multiple generations, diverse workforce? Where's the ownership lie? And what's you said earlier, the plan to really move it forward?
Any large company has a leadership development program. They have people that oversee that. Typically, it resides in the learning and development group. Sometimes it sits outside of it. But I think right now that's what they're wrestling with. They're wrestling with how do we help managers through a variety of techniques, right? How do we give them tools? How do we give them training in order to manage this?
And does the board play a role in this?
Broader, the board plays a bigger and bigger role in the culture of the organization. And I write about that quite extensively in the book, and I've talked about this quite extensively. We have lots of examples where culture was a big culprit in a corporate scandal or a major disruptor to the business. Just recently, we can think back to the Boeing 737 MAX tragedies, which the U.S. House of Representatives blamed on a culture of concealment inside of Boeing, meaning that people didn't feel psychologically safe to bring up, things that they were seeing, problems that they were worried about to management. There was obviously tragic results. Or Wells Fargo, where they had a culture of sales incentives that fueled those reps fraudulently opening and closing accounts so that they could, achieve those incentives. And that's something Wells Fargo is still reeling from today. We could go on, but what boards are now paying more attention to are those signals inside the culture. Previously, and still today, a lot of boards, their only notion of culture was filtered through the eyes of the CEO. Whatever the CEO was telling them, that's what they thought about culture, and maybe a little bit of info from the CFO or a couple other execs. Today, I've seen several boards set up separate culture subcommittees, just like your governance committee, audit committee, et cetera. And they're looking at data and looking at trends about the culture of the organization. And so it's both a risk management tactic, but it's also, for some companies, very proactive in that the board wants to stay on top of what's happening from a cultural perspective and what can we do to create an even healthier culture going forward.
Well, it's sort of like your financials, isn't it? I mean, your financial health and well-being, you look at your financials. Your people, which drive everything in a company, including your technology, what's the culture like? What's the health and well-being of them? So it seems to me that this is going to be even more on the radar of boards going forward, because that is what really drives the productivity, as you have in much of your research.
Yeah, what we're also seeing is that a number of boards are looking around the boardroom and realizing they probably over-architected on financial acumen, and they're very underrepresented on human capital acumen. So today I'm seeing a number of retired CHROs, but also active CHROs uh, being interviewed for open board seats, which I think is a healthy development long term, particularly for that last point that you just made. Our research shows that healthy cultures perform better in the market at a rate of 6x of unhealthy cultures. So if you want better financial performance, my advice always, first and foremost, focus on how you can create a healthier culture inside the organization.
That is the number that everybody should be focused on, right? When you look at your 2023 priorities and predictions report, um, your peer groups of senior HR executives who collaborate, I guess, around best practices, and they shared top priorities going into 2023. There were four of them. One stood out to me, but if you'd comment on all, the one that stood out was flexibility is not a concession, it's a strategy.
It's amazing to me how controversial this has become. I'm a firm believer that 5 to 10 years from now, we'll look back on the arguments that we had around remote work and on-site work and just laugh at how silly it all was. But what we're seeing in a lot of organizations today is there is a a policy that's forcing employees back into the office. I was talking about this with Amy Edmondson at Harvard recently, and she said anytime you try to force employees to do something, it's usually a bad thing. And that's what's happening today is, we're telling employees you must be in the office, say 3 days a week. And it's these days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or whatever days the company has picked. In many organizations, that has the result of a horse trade between the CEO and the CHRO, where the CEO wanted people in the office 5 days a week, the CHRO wanted true flexibility, and they bargained and settled on 3 days a week, which is kind of a silly way to do it. The reason we said flexibility is not a concession, which is what it is in most organizations, it should be a strategy, is that there are several organizations out there that are using a flexible work policy to attract and retain employees. One example is Allstate Insurance. Their CEO has said, it's kind of dumb for us to force people back into the office so they can sit in their office and do Zoom calls, or force them to commute long distances to get to the office. We're using flexibility as a marketing tool, and the applications to our company are through the roof. It's like 3x what they normally have. And I think that's just a healthy way to address it. Everybody has their own individual situation, and the pandemic taught us this, that there's a number of caregivers in your workforce that you probably didn't realize before. They're caring for children, they're caring for elders, et cetera. Or they have some other different aspect of their lives, and we got to know the true lives of our coworkers versus just the work persona throughout the pandemic. And so I would trust your managers, let them manage and do what's right for the organization, do what's right for the individual. There's plenty of people that want to be in the office every day. It's the technology's better. It's a better working environment for them. They can concentrate. They want to be around people. That's great. Give them that option. But if for whatever reason their life circumstances says the opposite, that's fine too. They can, just as long as they're productive. And we should be focused on goal achievement, not where somebody sits throughout the day.
So that's really pushing the responsibility down into the organization at the decision making with the manager for what's right. Yes, right. And that's the word you used is trust. You got to trust your manager to make sure. And if the productivity is there, everybody wins.
There's a huge lack of trust that's underlying this whole discussion, and our research has shown that the majority of senior executives aren't trusting the workforce, and the majority of the workforce isn't trusting senior executives because of some of these issues. And I think if you're a senior executive listening to this, you've got to look at the data and focus on goals, not if somebody's in the office or out of the office. If they're able to be productive and accomplishing their goals wherever they are, then that's what you should honor.
When we do a lot of executive recruitment, right? And people look at who's at the top, who's in the middle, what's the culture like, and they want to hear that CEO and who's left and who's stayed, and what the CEO is saying is really important to him or her, which is in the annual report or on YouTube. And so that whisper at the tops becomes a shout to attracting potential talent, right? And so what you're saying is it really has to be one where you can go in there and be trusted to do and produce. So speak about next practices in your book. What are the relevant, meaningful differences between best practices and next practices?
So when we do research, we go out to a database of over 40,000 organizations globally, and we certainly come up with a lot of best practices of top companies. But what we hang our hat on is that concept of next practice, which we define as a practice that clearly correlates to market performance or to bottom line business impact. And we get at that through regression analysis and other research methods to really understand it. But less than, say, 20% of companies have actually implemented that practice. That's our clue that it might be a next practice, and we dive into it further to really understand if it's a practice that we should call out that other organizations should be on the lookout for. And so in any study that we do, we usually come up with a handful of next practices that we say are future forward things that a few companies are doing and having great success with, but the majority of companies should really look at it. And every year we did the conference I referenced earlier. Every year we run a conference called Next Practices Now, where we focus purely on that. We focus on what are the practices that people should be on the lookout for going forward.
And what are some of those?
There's a lot. So
okay, I wasn't there, so I want to hear. Just give us 2 or 3 or 4.
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time at our conference talking about generative AI or Chat GPT, which is one tool in that space, and how it can be used in organizations. And so there's a number of companies that are using generative AI tools to automate tasks that I think previously just took up a lot of time but didn't take up a lot of brain power. So writing job descriptions is one, and a lot of companies are using ChatGPT just to write job descriptions today. Reviewing contracts, ChatGPT can do that far more quickly than a human being can. And so we spent a lot of time just talking about it's not about replacing jobs, not yet anyway. It's about how do you make jobs more effective and efficient going forward. And so that's certainly something that we've been calling out as a next practice. There's many others though. Talent mobility is another one that I've written a lot about and talked a lot about. If you ask managers inside an organization when they have an open job, is it easier to hire for that position from outside the company or within the company? They're typically going to say outside. And then if you ask employees, if you're looking for a new role, is it easier for you to find that outside the company or within the company? And they're typically going to say outside as well. High-performing organizations have a very formal approach to talent mobility, and they move people around inside the organization on a pretty frequent basis. It doesn't always have to be a promotion. In fact, a lot of times it's just lateral movements, but you gain so much more experience and knowledge. The collaboration and communication inside the organization improves. The less that managers are hoarding talent, especially good talent, in their groups and are actively trying to get that talent moving around the company, the better. Yet, it's less than 20% of companies that have formal talent mobility programs. So that's another one that I just think is a real key to healthy cultures.
It is. And, I have one of my clients is very focused on, he'll talk about, you come with us, it's a major regional bank, and you can have 8 careers with us. And like you said, some of it's lateral, but it's also a reskilling so that you can learn other skills and move up in other areas, and so one of the comments was, well, you may end up losing that person. Well, maybe, but they'll feel some loyalty and they've learned, and maybe I'll get somebody else from another company where they've done the same thing. So it's really enhancing the skill set of all employees, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned about rich company cultures really include people who are storytellers, effectively spinning tales. Is this part of one's culture, and does it make people feel more connected by leaders who tell stories about their own careers or history of the company? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's more about the history of the company. I think what you want the organization to understand is what are the values of the organization overall, and you want them to live those values and live behaviors that you expect in the company. And one of the best ways to get that across is telling stories about where the company came from, how did certain habits emerge inside the organization or rituals inside the company, where did those come from, that reinforce those values and behaviors overall. Some companies are very strategic about this. Qualcomm was one I know that used a storytelling process as part of onboarding, and they called it 52 weeks. And so every week, new employees would get a story sent to them in their inbox about something that happened in the past, something that explained, why the company, was doing something today, and so that they had that history, but it was also subtly reinforcing certain messages. One of which was innovation. They wanted to make sure that new employees were constantly encouraged to be innovative. That became so popular that existing employees, when they found out about this program, they would be signing up for 52 weeks as well. But I think storytelling can be very powerful, as can symbols. And I talk about that in the book as well. A lot of times a symbol is a shortcut to a story. One smaller organization that I profiled in the book called BDA, it's a sports marketing company. They've adopted Tigger, the Winnie the Pooh or Disney, series character, as their unofficial mascot, because they want people in their organization to have a Tigger attitude. And what they mean by that is you're a positive person willing to help. Tigger, he wasn't the brightest cat in the forest, but if Piglet was lost, right, he's going to go find him. And if somebody needed cheering up, he's going to cheer him up. And so they're encouraging their employees not only to be a Tigger at work, but be a Tigger in your life and just a positive influence to others around you. And so they hand out stuffed Tiggers on a pretty regular basis. And every year, one person gets the Major Tigger Award, which is kind of like this life-size Tigger. And so it's sometimes it's silly things like that, but it has a big impact on the organization.
And you feel so connected, right? I mean, everybody
Absolutely.
relates to that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all relatable. So besides leading this incredible company, I4CP, you currently serve on the board of Best Buddies in Washington, a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to establishing a global volunteer movement that creates opportunities for one-to-one friendships, integrated employment, leadership development, and inclusive living for people with intellectual and development disabilities.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Talk to us a little bit about this organization.
Yeah, this organization isn't only important to me; it's important to our whole company. We've been supporting Best Buddies for over a decade now, and I'll credit my VP of Sales, Madeline Borkin. She has a son with Down syndrome, and when we first hired Madeline, she alerted me to Best Buddies and got many in our company to understand what the organization was all about. And it's a wonderful organization. It was founded by Anthony Kennedy back in his college days. So it's been around for quite some time. And Best Buddies, it supports individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the board. What we've been able to do with Best Buddies is more from an employer perspective. Individuals with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, are usually high on the unemployment list. The unemployment rate for that community is 85, 90%. It's a very high unemployment rate. And so we've been helping organizations look at this community as a great source of talent. Mod Pizza is a great example where they've been very active in hiring from that community, and Best Buddies helps that. They support the individuals, they help find the individuals, support them while they're on their job. And a number of organizations have done this to bring very talented individuals into the workforce that also not only are great workers, but just helps the culture of the organization overall. So at our conference every year, we always have a talk about Best Buddies. We have representatives from Best Buddies there. We have this year we had one of the stars of the new Woody Harrelson movie about the basketball team that he coaches,
right?
Of all of teammates that all have IDD.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave a rousing speech at our conference, and we do a walk in support of Best Buddies. But for us at I4CP, it's just a cause that we all can rally around and support, and we do so both nationally and at the local level.
Well, again, this calls for more inclusivity, right? To leave nobody behind. And that's what you're doing. So, congratulations on that. I'm going to look into that a little bit more myself. So, we've had a very rich discussion, a lot of insights. I wish I had been at your conference. how, how can people go to your conference next year? What would you like our audience to know about I4CP, what you're doing? What leaders need to know?
Yeah, you can find out a lot more about us at our website, i4cp.com. The book that we've been referencing, Culture Renovation, also has its own website at culturerenovation.com. There's a lot more details at both of those sites. Our conference, we always hold it at the Fairmont in Scottsdale at the end of March. So we've already got the dates for it next year. So if you're inclined to join us, we'd love to have you there.
And so, what are your parting words? What do CEOs, CHROs, the leadership, the board, what do we need to do more of going forward? Because it's not just transforming, you're saying it's renovating. What are some key points you'd give to them?
Yeah, don't let culture just happen. Be proactive about it, measure it, look at trends over time, and make improvements to it. You never plant a flag in the ground and declare victory on culture. It's something you've got to work at and continue to work at constantly. But the companies that work at it typically have very healthy companies and perform better financially. It's the companies that ignore culture and just, under the guise that it's just going to happen. Those are the companies that oftentimes fall in that low performing category. So my biggest advice is don't be passive about this or even reactive, be proactive about it.
I think everyone needs to own this, correct? It doesn't just rest with one individual, but it starts at the top.
It starts at the top, but and as I stress in the book, you have to have cooperation of the workforce and a co-creation mentality inside the workforce. And there's a number of things you can do to create that, number of techniques that are outlined in the book. But you're absolutely right. It's not just one person's job.
So I recommend that everybody read Renovation Culture, these 18 strategies. And there are many lessons in the book of companies and who are high performing and what they've done. So, Kevin Oakes, thank you for joining us today and sharing your incredible story and what you're doing to really enhance and grow cultures in a positive way. And we're going to also read your 2023 priorities and predictions for the C-suite. So, as CEO and founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity, thank you so much for what you're doing for society and really people in general, and really raising everybody up in more productive, healthy, happier cultures. What you're doing is incredible, and I thank you for your time today, Kevin.
Oh, thanks, Janice.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in to another game-changing conversation on Leadership Reimagined. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit our website at elligroup.com. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Kevin Oakes.